And hello there, Peter Mansbridge here. You are just moments away from the latest episode of The Bridge Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth with Bruce Anderson. And yes, it's an SMT day. And you may wonder what that stands for if you're a new listener.
Sounds like a kind of a sandwich, doesn't it? Sounds like a sandwich.
Well, yeah, at least a sandwich. It actually stands for Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth. Bruce Anderson's in Ottawa. I'm Peter Mansbridge. I'm in Toronto today. And we have a number
Cool
of
name.
things.
I wonder who came up with it.
They what? What came up with what?
Said it's a cool name. I wonder who came up with that.
Well, I had to
Anyway,
think long and hard for it, and I listened to all kinds of possible entries for the name, and I took some of those entries and I kind of put them together. And
you had a meeting of the naming
bit.
committee.
The naming committee. Actually, Bruce was the main contributor to the title, Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth.
I came up with the name Good Talk too. I didn't get any credit for that.
You did it all. You
Thank
did
you.
it all.
There we go. There we go.
There's little you didn't come up with.
That's nice. I appreciate that.
Well, you're welcome. Okay. Here's your history lesson for today. It was 30 years ago this summer. Jean Chrétien walks into the Liberal caucus room to what he described as a bunch of nervous Nellies. Why were they nervous? They were nervous because Brian Mulroney had stepped down as prime minister at the time. And the Conservatives in their leadership convention had voted for Kim Campbell. And in that summer of 1993, Kim Campbell was way ahead in the national opinion polls. She was on their way to a huge majority government. And Liberal MPs were nervous. Nervous Nellies, Jean Chrétien called them. So what happened? Well, a couple of months later, the election was held and Kim Campbell returned with 2 seats, and she wasn't one of them. Those Conservatives were wiped out. Liberals won a majority government, the first of 3 for Chrétien. So the issue now is we haven't heard the term nervous Nellies on the part of the Liberal caucus by certainly any of them or anybody in the Prime Minister's office, but you wonder whether that's going to be the tone that will be taken today as the Liberals meet in caucus and a caucus retreat in London, Ontario. And Justin Trudeau just returned from let's say, attendance at a summit. And some problems with the airplane and some questions about how effective he'd been at the summit and all that. The Liberal MPs very nervous about polls which show them upwards of up to 14 points down. So there's your history. There's your content for today. Is this a nervous Nelly situation? How's Justin Trudeau going to handle this? Can he handle it?
No, I think if the term nervous Nelly, which is what Jean Chrétien intended, I think when he used it, is meant to imply that people have kind of irrational fears, exaggerated fears, are kind of overly pessimistic about their situation. I don't think this is that. I think there is a lesson to draw from that period of time. But the one that I would take from it, and I remember that campaign in 93, and I remember the run up to it, the leadership campaign in the Conservative Party, because I worked for Jean Charest in that. And I saw what happened in the Conservative Party, which was that it became quite divided between Kim Campbell, who was a very qualified person and candidate, but who wasn't all that effective at campaigning. And that over the course of the leadership, she went from having a really strong lead, a massive lead, to a very small lead by the time the convention rolled around. And in my view, if there had been one more week in that race, Jean Charest would have won that leadership race, and who knows how that subsequent election would have turned out. But the problem that was happening in the Conservative Party then does have some parallels in the Liberal apparatus right now. Once they settled the leadership, tried to pull the party together, it was still the case that they were campaigning as kind of incumbents. It was not a great campaign. They had not done enough preparation. They had not really estimated the strength of Jean Chrétien and the Liberals in that contest. And they almost took it for granted that people at some point were going to say, well, we can't have this guy. He's in no way qualified. He's not going to appeal to people. Remember, they ran an ad sort of making fun of whether he was qualified. I mean, people debate whether or not the intent of the ad was to make fun of his physical deformity, that the way that his mouth aligns when he speaks. I don't know whether that was the case or not, but it was certainly perceived that way. And during that campaign, the Liberals always had the Conservatives on their back foot. It was a defense scenario almost every day in that campaign. And so when I think about that experience and where the Liberals find themselves now, I think the caucus members who are restive, and I think there are a good number of them who are restive, I think they're worried that come the time of the next campaign, they'll be too timid, too defensive, unable to articulate what it is that they're fighting for. They'll rely too much on the idea that you can just demonize or belittle or otherwise marginalize your competitor. And they're savvy enough to know that those are mistakes that have been made by incumbents before. And they're savvy enough to kind of look at their situation and say, we feel like we're on defense all the time right now. I don't think they're wrong about that. So restiveness of this sort is the kind of productive chemistry that is necessary for a party to survive and thrive. It has to be something that happens within parties, because that level of energy and creativity does dissipate the longer a government is in office, and it needs to find a way to, combust again. It needs to find a way to be on offense sometimes, not always on defense, which is what it seems like it is to me now.
So what has to happen today and tomorrow? I mean, when you consider that ever since the cabinet shuffle, which was 6 weeks ago now, we've witnessed something in the Liberal Party that we haven't witnessed, since 2015, when Trudeau won his first of the 3 elections he's won. And that is Liberal MPs speaking out, seemingly a couple more every week. Initially, anonymously, talking to some reporters. I think it was Chantal actually was the first one to actually mention this, which was like 48 hours after the shuffle. She said she was picking up vibes weren't good for Trudeau from within the caucus. And ever since then it's built, and now it's not so anonymous anymore. Some MPs are speaking out. Still a minority group, but nevertheless, we haven't witnessed this before like this. So, Trudeau, I assume, unlike his father, who used to claim he never read the papers or watched television news, although I used to sit up in the parliamentary gallery, the press gallery, when I was a member in Ottawa, and Trudeau was the prime minister. Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister. You'd look down, you'd see him reading like newspaper clippings every once in a while, right? Anyway, assuming Justin Trudeau reads this stuff and watches TV, and I believe he does, I think you believe he does too, he must be very aware of what's going on, whether his staff is telling him or not. And so he's got to have an approach when he walks in that room later today and deals with MPs both, in the caucus room and outside of it. What's he got to say? What's your strategist / advisor / observer / analyst hat on? What does he got to do? What can he do? Or is it too late?
Well, is it too late is a really good question. I don't think it's too late, but it might be too late. But let's assume for the moment that it's not. And by that, I guess what I mean is I don't know that it's a foregone conclusion that the Conservatives will win the next election, but I think if the Prime Minister continues to operate more or less the way he has been operating, then I think it's very unlikely that he can beat Pierre Poilievre. So assuming that he wants to stay, which is what he said, and he wants to, he believes that he can beat Pierre Poilievre, I think that the thing that he needs to do with his caucus, and I know we're going to talk about this situation in the United States with Speaker McCarthy. It's kind of where you've got this kind of group of congressmen saying, you must obey us, to the speaker, the leader essentially of their party. That's not what needs to happen here. But there does need to be more openness on the part of the prime minister and the people around him to hearing what it is that MPs are experiencing at the doors, and to having a clear plan, something other than "don't be nervous Nellies." To go back to your Chrétien quote, they need to hear something that feels as though the 5-alarm fire that they are experiencing when they're out in their communities is noticed by the people in charge of their political operation. I don't think they've heard that so far. I don't think they've sensed that it has resulted in policy ideas that will help. But more importantly, I think they sense a kind of a timidity almost in the political response of the government, a kind of a pulling of the punch, a kind of an uncertainty. It's almost like a boxing metaphor that they're staggered. They're a little bit kind of dazed as a political operation. And so I think they need to not hear him rile them up with some sort of barn-burning speech, not hear anything that sounds like, I don't want to hear anybody else say another bad word about what we're doing or how we're doing it or how I'm doing. I don't think either of those things will particularly work. But I think there needs to be an exchange. I think he needs to ask people to talk to him more about what they're hearing, to share ideas about how to deal with the issues that people think the government hasn't been good enough on, how to talk about the conservative challenge, and maybe be less preoccupied with the NDP challenge, which is always there. But most of those MPs who will be in that caucus meeting who are worried about losing their seats, they're worried about losing their seats to Conservatives, not to NDP candidates. And so their preoccupation is going to be, what are we going to say? Not just about this guy, but about our ideas and about why we would be a better choice at the next election. That's the conversation that needs to bring them together. And then they need to be able to exit and kind of watch how that manifests itself as a strategy going into the fall and through the winter. Big question marks about whether or not that's the energy that he's going to bring, the prime minister is going to bring to that meeting. Hope for his sake and his party's sake that's the contest that they're preparing to have.
Well, yeah, I don't disagree what about what you've said, but I do also agree that the government, through the prime minister and his ministers, has got to get their act together on what they stand for on the big issues of the day. And if the big issue of the day is housing, I mean, there are big issues out there, inflation and climate change and that, and some of those things, we kind of know what they stand for, but housing is the emerging issue. They went to a great deal of trouble in the shuffle to put in a communicator in Sean Fraser, the Liberal MP from Atlantic Canada. And I don't know him, but I've watched him. I've seen him speak to an audience. He's good. He's absolutely a good communicator. But I watched him the other day on Vashi Capello's show on Sunday. And, he didn't seem, at least to me, to have an answer on any of the questions Vashi asked. Now, I know it's only 6 weeks on the job, and they're trying to develop a new approach on housing. But if you're a communicator and if you're going to agree to go on a show like that, you really should have something to say other than we don't know yet, or, we're working on it, or stuff like that. You've got to have an answer. And right now, they need answers if they're going to try and, stop the slide, or at least begin the turning the ship around a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Sorry, Pete, go ahead.
Well, no, that's all. That's the point I wanted to make. If you're going to have a new message something that will buoy your caucus and encourage the people that you haven't sort of given up. You got to have that message. You got to say something. You got to say it now. I mean, it's not like there hasn't been. It's not like housing just suddenly became an issue.
This is the problem I see sometimes when politicians become part of a government, and they don't forget that they're politicians, but they kind of put that part of their effort or their thought process aside. And I have a lot of time for Sean Fraser. I think he's a really good, really effective minister. He's relatively new in cabinet, and he's dealing with the most hot button issue that the country has, which has arguably maybe other than climate change, it's the hardest to fix, or to appear to be able to fix in any reasonable period of time. So he's dealing with a difficult situation. But to your point, the government doesn't seem able at a political level to say, well, if we can't tell people exactly how we're going to solve this, or if we can't tell people exactly the answer to the question that's being asked, we better give them a better answer than we have been giving them. And that's not true just on housing. I watched Mary Ng last night. She was at the London caucus meeting, or at the run up to it, and she was asked questions about the relationship between Canada and India, and the stories coming out of that India trip about our relationship with Modi and so on. And I felt for her a little bit, because she obviously didn't have a green light to say anything about the nature of that relationship that had some substance to it. And so she did what people in politics are kind of obliged to do sometimes, which is kind of skate around and kind of run out the time on the answer. And I feel like something has gone wrong in the system, in government, where they can't say, well, we can't say nothing. So what are the three things that we can say that have some bite to them, that people can hear and understand? Like, I'll come back to the India point in a minute. But for Sean Fraser on housing, at the very least, if you say, this is what I've found out about our problem with housing since I've taken this job. We built this many houses. This is what slows down the pace of home building in this country. This is what needs to change in order for that to happen. We don't control all of those variables, but we're trying to get everybody together who does control those variables so that we can have a big national push. Now, I didn't see the interview. Maybe he said something that sounded like that. But I think at the very least, you need to be able to say, here's some facts. Here's our intent. Here are the steps that we're taking, and stay tuned. I feel that level of structure and politics in the government's message is missing too often, because ministers, as ministers, end up being reminded all the time of the things they shouldn't say, can't say yet, still to be discussed, still to be decided. Somebody might get annoyed if you say this way, or that message hasn't been approved at Prime Minister's office. All of those things enter the minds of ministers when they're doing these interviews. And the net effect isn't better messaging, it's less messaging. And I think that's part of the problem that the government has. They need more people to take more shots. By that, I don't mean attacks, but I do mean, to put some energy behind what it is that they're saying. And they need that to happen every day.
I want to ask a Polyev question, but you wanted to say, did you want to say something more about the India trip?
Yeah, I did. I was reading a couple of pieces about it, and one in particular in the National Post. And I know it's it's one of our two national papers, and so I should give it, all of its due. But sometimes I do find that the editorial direction of that chain is a bit prominent in the reporting of news. And yesterday's piece that I read was a kind of an example of that. It essentially set up the notion that because the Indian leader, Modi, is unhappy with us, and showed that unhappiness in one way or another towards Trudeau during this G20 meeting, that this meeting was a failure for Canada. And I thought to myself, well, how did we get to a situation where the judgment of whether we're having a good meeting with Modi is whether he's happy with our position? Because our position, I mean, these are complicated issues, but our position, our idea isn't to make every leader in the world happy, especially leaders with whom we have significant disagreements. It should be to take our point of view, to put it on the table, to try to have a respectful dialogue, to understand that there's some situations where we're going to be convincing and our pressure, along with the pressure of others, will have some effect. But also to understand that we live in a world where that's not going to happen sometimes, but it doesn't mean that we should suck up to leaders with whom we have profound disagreements. So I found myself looking at that thinking, and you know this, Peter, you probably covered when Joe Clark lost his bags. What year was that? 1970 something or other, right? Way back in the annals of time.
All of 78.
Fall of 78, right? So there can be a kind of a feeding frenzy. A plane broke down. This guy, when they shook hands, it seemed cold. And I kind of feel like that tendency of some in journalism to say, let's just make it a whole story of disaster. And I think the Sun put a kind of a disaster frame on it on their Sunday Toronto Sun front page, because we want to tell a story about disaster. I don't know that that was I don't think that was a fair characterization of that G20 or the conversations. And I feel like if that's the only version that people get, it's no wonder that over time they end up feeling like, well, maybe this government has kind of completely lost its way, which I don't think is true. But I think the government's problem isn't just fighting against Pierre Poilievre. I do think that there is a fairly significant tilt in the part of the news media towards the idea of a change and to the conservative challenge.
It's funny,
not across the board.
Right. It's funny you mentioned the Clark lost bags thing, because the difference there on that one was Clark was trying to establish himself as a potential prime minister. He was opposition leader at that time. He was going to take a world tour. He was going to go to a bunch of different countries. India was one of them.
Did you go on that?
I did not. We didn't have the cash, CBC, to afford that trip. Those were the days where you had to travel with like a crew of 5. It was the early days of electronic news gathering, and it was very complicated and very expensive.
So now you just take a phone, away you go.
Yeah, exactly. I think on that particular trip, neither of the major television networks went. Anyway, but a lot of others did go on it, mainly print, radio as well. And what happened was it became this gang up, right? It wasn't just one news chain that were writing these stories. Everywhere he went, the story became, what was the latest screw up? Lost bags. You almost walked into a guard in an honor guard parade, a guy holding a sword or something. And, there was the famous quote in India where he asked an Indian farmer, what's the totality of your acreage? So this became this whole thing about the word totality, which is actually.
It's a good example of, like, I don't want to stop your flow, but how bad a problem was it to say what's the totality of your acreage?
Exactly. But
everybody like,
Yeah, they owe it. So the thing was a disaster. Since that time, and what is that now, like 45 years ago? Since that time, no opposition leader has gone on that kind of a world tour to establish their credentials in the foreign policy area. Like, do you see Pierre?
And nobody throws a football back and forth on the lawn in front of the Parliament buildings for the same reasons. Yeah.
And Robert Stanfield, that famous 72, I think it was, or 74 election campaign picture, where he threw a football back and forth with reporters for 5 or 10 minutes, perfect throws, perfect catches, and then suddenly bobbled one. And Doug Ball, the CP for photographer, was a friend of mine. I mean, it was show, he had the picture of the fumble, and he sent it in. In those days, they just sent in their roll of film, and the photo editor in Toronto went through all the pictures and said, this one, and bang, it ended up everywhere, and it was disastrous. But the point I was trying to make is, since those days, especially on the foreign tours, you don't see them happen that much, or if they happen like suddenly they appear there. They don't take a gaggle of journalists with them. I mean, you haven't seen Pierre Poilievre turn up in Kyiv in the middle of the night to meet Zelensky and talk about how he would do things in Canada or anywhere else. I mean, I'm not sure what foreign trips he's taken. Has he been to Washington? Has he been to Mexico City? Has he been to London? I don't know. Perhaps he has. But it's just not as evident for those kind of reasons, that the littlest thing can become the biggest thing all of a sudden. And in a way, it's, Trudeau probably is saying, please don't send me to India again, because I can't win. Some of it for his own missteps. Remember the one a couple of years ago, and the outfits he was wearing when he got there. I mean, it's not been a good time. All right.
That was not good. No.
We
sound like the rest is history podcast today. I like it. We're going back in time into the vault. You know what? Though, but one more point on this. What you just said about, well, Trudeau's probably thinking, don't send me here, because it could go wrong. This is, and I don't know that he is saying that. He tends to be, I think, by character, a turn me loose, let me fight kind of guy. And so, but I do think that the apparatus of government tends to condition the prime minister to not do very many risky things, almost none. And sometimes you have to do risky things, especially if you're 10, 12, or 14 points behind in the polls. Contrast that attitude towards what you can do, the shots you could take, the surprises that you could generate, with this much ballyhooed moment where Pierre Poilievre took the mic on a flight back from the Conservative convention filled with Conservative Party delegates to Calgary, and gave a little rah-rah commentary. That has been seen by I don't know how many people, but it's a lot. And it was a good stunt for him. I know that there are people who are outraged that the safety equipment on the plane was used for something other than safety and that sort of thing. But, maybe there is some sort of process that should be followed there. I don't know. But I think just as a piece of raw politics, it wasn't the most imaginative thing in the world. But it's the kind of thing that people do when they're not afraid of making a mistake, when they're not being told, don't try something different. It's exactly, in my view, the kind of thing that Justin Trudeau would have done 8 years ago. And everybody, as you saw in the at least the image that I saw, all the phones were out, everybody was recording it, and you kind of knew at that moment that this was going to be a bit viral and it was going to reach a lot of people. And the things that he was saying with a smile, not a snarl. And he was saying them to people who would largely kind of go, I kind of like, he's got almost an optimistic bitterness towards the government that is a different chemistry than he had a year ago. And I don't want to overdo it, but I really think that he is a significant challenger to this government, and they need to be willing to try things that are as disruptive as the things that Pierre Poilievre is trying to do. Not necessarily imitate him, but just remember that politics is such a game that you have to take shots too.
Optimistic bitterness. There's one for the file. That's quite a term.
I don't know. I could be
going a lot longer than I'd plan to go on this. We still have a couple of things we want to do. I don't know whether we'll get to them all, but one thing I know we have to get to is our first break. So let's do that, and we'll be right back. And welcome back. You're listening to Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth on The Bridge, Wednesday edition. Bruce Anderson's in Ottawa. I'm Peter Mansbridge in Toronto. You're listening on Sirius XM, channel 167, Canada Talks, or in your favorite podcast platform, or you're watching us on YouTube, our YouTube channel, which gets more and more viewers every week, and we're glad you're joining us. We also get lots and lots of comments on our YouTube channel. And I see them and I read them, and they're mostly very constructive. Don't always agree with us. That's fine. You don't have to. There are, of course, some other kinds of comments as well, which I just find hilarious.
There's some ways that we can make money too. I've noticed that people have ideas on how we can make money from home by just clicking on something. I haven't done it yet.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Fair enough.
But anyway, we love comments. And the Mansbridge podcast at gmail.com is also where you can send your comments, and you may become a part of the Thursday Your Turn show along with the Random Ranter. Okay. Back briefly. You mentioned you wanted to say something about Poilievre. So, and, a couple of days after their convention in Quebec City, which seemed to go pretty well for them, there were the normal issues that have come up that you highlighted last week, you and Chantal, about potential problems in a convention like that with a huge lead that they seem to have in the polls. But you wanted to add something else.
Yeah, I was reading a piece in the Star about this, and it kind of touched on a number of points that I thought were interesting, and including things that happened on the floor of the convention, the Conservative convention in Quebec City. One of the things was that Mr. Poilievre's wife spoke, and she talked about being an immigrant who lived in Quebec. She referred to Québécois bands and music that she was interested in. She, I think, said something that a lot of Quebecers would kind of appreciate, which is that she said she spoke Québécois. And I grew up in Montreal and Valleyfield and kind of know the difference between Québécois French and Parisian French, and the idea that people should be proud of the way that they speak French in Quebec, or at least acknowledge that it's unique. So there was all of that, which I thought was quite good. And of course, we talked about this before, that her voice talking about him as a family man has been quite a helpful thing to his image with Canadians. He also, though, said some things that, in another time would have captured more attention. He said, "Vive la nation québécoise." That's a very interesting statement for a conservative leader to say. And there was a time when that would have been the headline coming out of that meeting. And it's kind of indicative of the degree to which his political acumen is almost priced into the coverage of him now. And again, the silence, I think, on those kinds of points, and I don't think he was wrong to say that. I think that what he's been trying to do is knit together the notion of, if you thought the Conservative Party was anti-immigrant, anti-gay, anti-Quebec nationalism, I'm going to tell you, my father's gay, vive la nation québécoise, I'm pro-choice, and I'm here in Quebec because I, really want your support. It was a more full-throated embrace of the idea of winning seats in Quebec than we've seen from a conservative leader in a long time. And it was, I thought it was quite remarkable. And again, it's, people are going to be surprised at how many positive things I'm saying about the way that he's approaching politics. I don't think that he has the right policy prescriptions in many areas, or any policy prescriptions in some areas. I'm just commenting on the quality of his politicking, and I can't help but notice that it seems pretty effective and well thought out.
The style is the man himself. Remember that one? You want history? 68. Pierre Trudeau.
Yeah.
And listen, there were a lot of things about there were substantive things about last weekend that could cause him problems, and the split that showed within his party on some of those key social conservative issues. Um, but if they walk away thinking about the kind of things you just mentioned and the little spiel on the plane, um, by the way, you should note that he and or his advisors got approval first of all from the airline to do what he did using the flight attendants, you know, public address system to make his little speech.
Look,
Anyway,
I've heard people sing songs using that apparatus. It's not like the only time it ever gets used is for safety messages or that kind of thing. So
but they're
I
usually
think there's
when they do that and coming back from the Grey Cup or something.
something like that. Yeah.
Anyway, whatever. Let's move on because
But you know what, though, if we go back to Aaron O'Toole,
every time I
his
try to
shit,
move on, you hear what he does. He kind of interrupts and plows forward with something else, making the timing difficult. But we'll get there. Go ahead, make your
we'll get
last
there.
comment, then we move on to the next subject.
Remember the Aaron O'Toole convention? Coming out of that convention, there was huge sense of disarray because the party said we don't really accept climate change, and the previous and the run up to it was there's a lot of pro-life MPs, and so Aaron O'Toole came out of his convention wounded by those internal pressures. I don't think that's true about Pierre Poilievre. We didn't hear. I mean, there were some motions adopted on the floor, and they knew that they were going to have those kind of motions that were going to be controversial. But they had said before, as you and I and Chantal talked about, that these weren't necessarily going to be party policy, and that the leader wasn't going to be bound by those things. And in fact, the way that he communicated his approach from a values standpoint and an intention standpoint was to reassure people that those controversial motions weren't going to be party policy. Now, whether that was being honest or not remains to be seen, but at least it was well managed, I think, from that standpoint.
All right.
I'll stop.
We're not going to get to the Kevin McCarthy stuff, which is fine.
Oh, no.
Which is fine. But what we are going to get to is this, I don't know, trending movement, should we call it? The I will not comply movement that we've seen on some social media. And let me give the quick background. Yesterday, we did our COVID update with Dr. Lisa Barrett from Halifax. And she was great. And she's kind of gave her sense, her opinion on where things stand and how we should, as individuals, react to the fact that there is clearly a bit of a resurgence going on, not totally unexpected, by the way, of COVID this fall. No mandates out there, but the knowledge that there's a new booster coming. There's also a vaccine on the RSV, which is also another a disease that is spreading that affects a respiratory situation. But how one should approach this and who the vulnerable sectors are, et cetera, and how you may consider as a personal venture, you might consider masking at some point in terms of areas with big crowds, hockey games as they come onto the agenda in another few weeks, that kind of thing. Anyway, it's a good conversation, some nice reaction we've heard from listeners. But this new trend, which quite frankly, I hadn't noticed till you pointed it out to me, Bruce. This I will not comply issue. Tell me about what you're thinking on that. You better explain it first of all.
Yeah, well, look, I think that the reaction to the COVID pandemic, as we know, has become a major point in what is generally described as kind of the culture war that's a big part of our democracy and certainly a huge part of the U.S. political system now. And I see it as having two dimensions. There's obviously one dimension where people are saying, I didn't want to be told by government how to live my life, what to put in my body, what to wear on my face, how to organize my business, what sorts of things I need to do in order to be able to travel on public conveyances, all of that kind of rejection of the authority of government has become a much bigger part of our political life because of the COVID experience. I think some of those attitudes were obviously simmering there, but COVID gave them a reason to become organized, highly visible, politically potent, and to attract the interest of leaders who are populist by nature, like Donald Trump. I think we now have a situation where we're heading into potentially another difficult COVID season. You talked to an expert in that. I don't know how bad it's going to be, but I do know that relative to the first version of COVID, where people were anxious and there wasn't much resistance to the idea of get us a vaccination, please, as soon as you can, and where can we get the masks so that we can wear them and protect ourselves and protect other people. We're not going to have that experience again should a pandemic of a similar size and risk appear on our. So what it does is it poses a question for both the opposition party in Canada and for the government. If it's a regular flu season style of a situation, maybe there won't be very much politics around it. But what we do see happening in the political culture in America, and we've seen it come up north of the border a little bit. It was trending on Twitter in Canada, this "I will not comply" thing. And what that really is that this intersection of people having rejected the science and the evidence of what can keep them safe and keep society safe on COVID, and wanting to express that as an act of political activism towards incumbent governments. As I say, I think it could pose a question for the Conservatives as to whether or not they're going to be too closely aligned with those sentiments, because those sentiments aren't, I will not comply because here are 1,500 scientists who say the vaccines don't work. I will not comply because I love Trump, or I hate Trudeau, or, my cousin, said that their health was harmed because of the vaccination they got. It's a collection of attitudes that has less to do with science and more to do with the politics of it. On the government side, I think the question is, how bad would things have to be from a risk standpoint before government would ever again consider the kind of mandates that were put in place the last time we went through this? And I do think that is in part a political calculation, not just a science calculation, because on some level, the non-compliance thing is not, it's not just about if you put more rules in place or you yell your position louder that people will comply. Sometimes the opposite can happen. And so I think it's an interesting dynamic. I hope it goes away, because I don't think that the idea of non-compliance as a thing in society is a good thing. But I know that the politics of it are pretty sensitive and combustible.
I get a kick out of how Trump is portrayed in some of these things as if he's on side with all those who are not complying. I mean,
he says he is too. Yeah,
this is the guy who, and good for him, funded the vaccination program.
Took credit for it.
Yeah, then took credit for it. Suggested everything to, what was it, drinking toilet bowl cleaner or something, or horse injections and whatever to prevent you from getting COVID, and then damn near died himself in the hospital. So the story goes, when he had COVID. So the story goes. um, uh, with all the latest technology and research materials available at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Those, his people in the medical community who were working on him said, he came close to death in that couple of days. I find that a little surprising because he was up and around like in a couple of hours, 48 hours anyway. Anyway, he's somehow portrayed as the anti vaccine, the person who wouldn't comply.
Don't remember though. He said, you don't forget, he's 6'3", 185 or some like 250 or something. Like
15.
He's as fit as Aaron Rodgers. He's like the same size and wait, so that helped him.
But he has a better Achilles heel than Aaron Rodgers has.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Come on. Yeah, I don't know. And the part we don't get to because it just would take too long to properly explain it is the decision to move ahead and impeach, or at least begin an impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden, and this by the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, who is clearly being pushed by not only the right wing in his caucus, but also by Trump. You got to do this because Trump clearly wants, if he's going to end up running against Biden again, he wants them to be on equal ground, having both been impeached. But the whole thing's a joke. There is absolutely nothing so far. And hey, if they've got evidence, bring it forward. But they haven't brought it for any evidence forward so far. And they admit they have no evidence that Joe Biden has done anything wrong. His son, well, that's another story. But Joe Biden, apparently, so far, there's no evidence he's done anything wrong. If there is, then go for it. Have your impeachment inquiry. Nevertheless, that's all happening. And there you go. I've wrapped it up. There's nothing more to say on that subject.
Are you sure? Can I add one thing?
You can have 1 minute of time on this.
That's all I need.
But I can't give you more than that.
People should listen to this quote by Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida from the floor of the House.
You got it? Play
because
it. If you got it there, play it.
All right. Hang on. Here we go.
I rise today to serve notice. Mr. Speaker, you are out of compliance with the agreement that allowed you to assume this role. The path forward for the House of Representatives is to either bring you into immediate total compliance or remove you pursuant to a motion to vacate the chair. Mr. Speaker.
That quote, I mean, you and I have watched American politics for a long time. I've never seen anything like that in terms of the way that American politics works typically is that the speaker has a lot of authority, a lot of influence, and the arguments that preceded this are normally held behind closed doors, that there is a real sense of we wouldn't do this publicly because our opponents would take advantage of it, or because it's just not done. It's not the way that politics in a political party should work. But Kevin McCarthy is a very unique character, and this is a very unique time in American politics where you've got these populist right-wing politicians who think it's their role to hold him to account publicly and to challenge his position if he doesn't agree. And the strangest part of all is that he seems to go, all right, if this is what you need me to do, I'm going to do it. It's not a great time in American politics.
No. And the interesting thing about this one is there seemed to be a number of Republicans offside, both in the House of Representatives, certainly in the Senate, and also on the analyst side of things, Republican analysts and commentators. I heard one this morning say, "Worst speaker in the history of the United States." Yeah, there you go. All right. Listen, thanks, Bruce. And thanks for bringing the clips along today. We have a whole new role for Bruce on Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth now. He brings the clips.
You can just here to serve. I'm in compliance.
Excellent. Yeah, you will comply. All right. Thank you, Bruce. Bruce will be back on Friday, of course, for Good Talk with Chantal. Tomorrow it's your turn and the Random Ranter. So join us for all that. I'm Peter Mansbridge. Thanks so much for listening today. We'll talk to you again 24 hours.